All right, in this next video, this is a continuation of the stick welding video where we're welding horizontal. We're going to look at welding in the vertical position. The same general rules are going to apply to all welding positions with respect to angles, travel speed, arc length, so on and so forth. The difference is that in the downhand positions, flat and horizontal, and we didn't do any true flat welding in the previous video, but in the horizontal position, if your arc's a little long, you can get away with it. It's not the end of the world. In the vertical position, you really can't get away with a longer arc. So if you find that you're hovering over your plate and your horizontal welds, if you find that you can see that little transfer of metal, that little drip, 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 coming off the end of the rod, if you're getting spatter, any of those conditions that you're having problems with, if you're going high or low, if you're having trouble staying in the groove, okay, you don't want to even attempt verticals at that point. It's just going to cause you all kinds of problems. You're going to get really frustrated. You need to be able to lay down really consistent, really smooth horizontal welds. And your travel is going to get steadier with time. You shouldn't see huge variations in the ripple pattern as you're welding. That can be an indication that your arc is getting long and you're plunging it in short. Remember, that weld is in a semi-solid state, as you're traveling just a quarter inch past where the arc is. So it's like, slush on the road. If you live in a northern climate, you know what that is. You step into it, or mud, and anywhere where it gets muddy, springtime. You kind of step into it and it leaves that permanent upset around your foot. Well, when you push the rod in, it will upset some metal, okay? So again, if you're having those problems in the downhand position, work on them. The rod should lightly touch, lightly drag, at least occasionally. The arc wants to be in tight to where at the end of the rod you get like this solar eclipse look. And what I mean by that, again, is the rod should be in so close that the rod itself is dark like the moon, blocking the sun, is that ring of fire around the edge of the rod. That's what I'm talking about when I say that solar eclipse look. As soon as I pull that rod back even slightly, I'm going to have problems on a vertical, right? So on a vertical, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm actually going to start with a horizontal weld, and I'm going to consciously put a weld down that is a little bit large at the beginning of the plate, and by the time I get to about 2/3 of the way up, halfway to 2/3 the length of the plate, and these plates are a foot long, I'm going to get that weld really tiny. So that's going to allow me to start doing my verticals with a weave, okay? And the reason for that is simple. When you're welding in any position other than vertical, the puddle is easy to see because it's behind you. Well, when you're welding vertical, the puddle is below the rod, right? The rod is blocking your view of the liquid. So by starting off with a weave, and we're gonna weave over a horizontal weld, okay? You'll be able to see that puddle chase the rod to the left and chase the rod to the right and kind of go back and forth. And as that weld that we're welding over gets smaller and smaller, the weave will get narrower and narrower until eventually we're right in the corner. And then we kind of have an idea as to what's going on underneath that bead. You're going to bisect the angles. Again, now the angle is left and right, so the plate is vertical. The rod can't be way over to the left or way over to the right. It's got to be dead center. I want the rod to be level to slightly uphill. Right, I want that. We're welding uphill, by the way. Just FYI, we're not going downhill with 70/18. So the rod wants to be level to slightly uphill. If the rod is pointed downhill, you're pointing the rod at what's already liquid. Okay, we want the rod pointed at the cold, unwelded virgin plate, or slightly up above it. As you're welding uphill, you have to remember to raise your arms. Right, it's a real easy habit to get into for new people, to be focused so much on the tip of that rod that instead of lifting their arms as they travel, they point the rod uphill, and then eventually the rod is pointed really uphill. And what that'll do is that'll bring the rod in closer proximity to the liquid puddle, and it will melt the flux off the bottom edge of the rod, and the rod will stick. It'll also make the arc huge, unmanageable, and it will change the direction of the arc from straight ahead into the cold base metal to down at what's already hot. And if you're heating what's already hot, things are going to go bad in a hurry. So I'm going to drop my amperage to 108. I would suggest, it's easy to say, well, let me make it colder, okay? But if it's too cold, the puddle won't wet out. Okay, so the puddle needs to wet out as you're welding. So resist the temptation to go too cold. More often than not, if you run into problems, people will turn the machine down, not up. But again, if the puddle doesn't wet out on its own, then that's a problem. If you know that the rod is in tight, that you're not maintaining a long arc, you're not pointing the rod downhill, you're not traveling so fast that you're ahead of the puddle, gouging a hole into the plate, you're right in that liquid, then you may find that if it seems too hot, that it's actually too hot, that you need to turn your amperage down. But more often than not, when people are getting started, it's not the amperage that's the problem, it's you. So you really need to focus heavily on those details. And again, in terms of those details, it's going to be easier to see the puddle if we start with a weave. All right, we're going to start doing vertical welds, but before I do, I'm just going to quickly demo what I just spoke about. I'm going to tack this plate up. So I do it without sticking the rod. Assist me in doing that. So I'm going to start rolling my rod angle back, and I'm going to start making that first pass smaller and smaller. My rod angle is going to approach 90 degrees. I'm going to keep the rod real tight. And now I'm almost pushing, and I'm pushing the rod into the plate. And I'm going to excessively push that travel up. So what I'm looking for here, as I mentioned, is this is kind of an assist on the verticals, okay? It's a way to cheat, if you will. Now this isn't necessary to learn how to weld verticals, but it's a good starting trick. And this is definitely something I would recommend, especially if your first few attempts at doing verticals are going south in a hurry. All right, I'm going to reposition the camera. We'll stand this up. Again, weld that tapers from large to small, and then the last half of the plate is not welded at all. So I'm going to reset the camera. We'll start welding verticals. So again, the left and right weave. I'm going to hold the edges as I weave, and I'm going to go back and forth. You're going to watch the puddle. Chase the rod. It takes a second to get the puddle established. And I want you to watch that puddle chase left, right. Notice how short the arc is. When I go over to the left and to the right, I feel the rod bump into the plate. As we go up this plate, and I'm weaving to the toe of the previous weld, that weld is going to get narrower. So my weave is going to get smaller. I'm going to hone in on a straight path. So with that next rod, we will end up at the top of that weld, and we will eventually be going straight. So I'm going to chip off the slag. I'm going to move the camera up. You can see that first bead is fairly large. The weld is a little ropey looking because of the weaving. And again, that's not what we're going for, but if you start that way, it makes it a little easier to see the puddle. So it's a good way to start off if you're a little bit unsure of what you're doing. I gotta make sure the camera stays in focus. And here we go. I'm gonna readjust the camera and then back in the middle. So I'm gonna strike, left, round, and try to blend that in. Okay, striking the arc will be a little harder in the vertical because there's less amps. I'm not running as hot. I don't have as much heat, if you will, to get that arc struck. So don't be surprised if it's a little harder. You're going to round the loop and then back in. I'm going to pick up the pace because I'm going to work towards, oh, there we go, I stuck the rod. You know, it's funny, I don't think I've mentioned sticking the rod yet in this video. I guess now's a good time as any. If you happen to stick the rod, you want to burn that bad end off. I got a bad end right here on a piece of scrap. So I'm going to reach back. I guess I'm on camera, but on this piece I welded before, I'm just going to burn this off. It'll be harder to strike the arc because there's no flux. Once I get done, I will have a hollow depression into the rod. I'm going to break that off with my fingertips, right? And now I can restrike that arc. Let's try this a second time. The plate is just balancing on the table, folks, so for me to aggressively pull it off or whatever, react quickly, I just end up knocking something over. So that's why I just stopped and disconnected it from the electrode holder. Here we go again. Sorry about that. Again, I can still see that puddle going left and right, but it's narrower. As I get closer to the corner, the bead gets smaller, and it gets a little harder to see what I'm doing, so I just have to take on faith that it's doing it right. So now we're at the very top. Now I'm going to keep that rod fairly tight in that corner, but I'm still going to manipulate left and right slightly. The core of the rod, that steel core, is always pointed directly into the corner. I'm never weaving so wide that core is going past the factory corner down the middle of those two plates. Again, I'm going to move the camera up. We'll take another peek. All right, so we'll chip the slag off. So again, we are closing in on a normal size weld, okay? So it starts off large at the bottom, and we are weaving smaller and smaller, and now we're just up in the corner. So the next rod will be entirely welded in that clean corner. So we're not going over anything. That does not mean that we're not going to weave. We're still going to weave. It's just it's going to be very, very slight. Okay? Very, very slight. So I'm going to check the focus. Looks good. All right, here we go. So the rest of this plate, again, a slight weave. Very, very small, left and right. Just enough to keep that puddle moving. Keep the arc tight. Don't get ahead of the puddle. Keep the rod right down in there. And we'll finish this vertical off.
if you look at the bright area of the arc, there's like a glow. And then you see the orange puddle slightly below it like a horizon. The bright area of the arc should be fairly horizontal. If it starts to droop down in the middle, it means that the puddle is pumping out like a pot belly. And we don't want that to happen. It's a little bit hot right now. This is only a 2-inch wide plate, 1/4 inch thick. So I'm going to keep going to the end of this electrode. Every time I weave left and right, I am bumping the plate with the rod.
So we'll give this a second to cool, then I will clean this thing up. Chip the slice, see if it wants to. And if you keep your arc short, you won't have to pound on the slide to get it off. I'm going to lay this down, clean this up real quick. Wicked hot. Alright, so let me get my flashlight out, take a peek. Alright, so again, there is the top of the weld, just above the pliers. Right here, in fact, is the restart, and that is what we're looking at for a 7018 single pass weld. We started off with a really big weld at the bottom, and again we just transitioned over that until we eased our way into the corner. Now don't hesitate to just start off with a weld in the corner, you know, but if you find that you're struggling with it, then back up and do that little weave trick, and then ease your way in. We're going to go ahead and do some vertical welding, multi-pass. I'm going to start by putting a bead right up the length of this plate. I'm going to keep it 1/4 inch in size. Here we go, next electrode. Again, 1/8 inch electrode, 108 amps. Cheap little inverter from Amazon. And I gotta tell you, it runs pretty damn nice. Nice. We'll let that cool down, and we're going to chip the slag off, see how she looks, start another pass. So hard to do with the camera in the way. So So there is the camera's on a fixed focus, so I apologize. This keeps going in and out of focus. There's the first bead. If I can get it held at just the right distance, it'll be in focus. Okay, I'm gonna let that cool down. We'll come back. Now on this multi-pass weld, what we're basically gonna do is you can do weaves and you can do stringer beads, and you need to learn how to do both. So I'm actually going to run stringer beads on the bottom half of this, and then I'll weave the top half, okay? So essentially what I want to accomplish here is I want to demonstrate both methods, because you need both methods. Some people don't like weaving, and whatever. If you're not welding on material that has a heat input restriction, preheat and interpass requirement, there's no reason not to weave, and there's a lot of benefits for it. But that doesn't mean you put down a big gorilla weave and just keep putting one bead over one bead over one bead. But you'd be better off to weave one pass in a groove weld than you would be to attempt to squeeze in two. You're just going to lock yourself up and trap slag. So anyway, on the bottom of this, we're going to be going up. I'm going to strike the arc on the left-hand side. I just weld what's closest to me first because I'm right-handed. And I'm going to have a little weave pattern. I'm going to kind of hold the edge, whip out, hold the edge, whip out, hold the edge, whip out. And I'm going to travel up this side, okay? Same basic technique as we would use for horizontal. I'm lengthening the leg on the left, and I'm bringing the weld so it covers most of the previous pass on the right. So here we go. If I don't stick the rod first. Again, my plate's just balancing. So this is not what I would classify as a weave. A slight little wiggle to try to help this puddle spread out. My total left and right movement is only equal to about the core diameter of the rod. About 1/8 of an inch. I'm physically putting down a smaller weld. The geometry of what I'm filling is less. So I will travel farther with the first electrode than I did on the first pass. But I'm only going to go up about halfway on this saw. That's about where I'll make it. So it took me about 2 rods to get that far on the root. And that's because I'm filling in a 90-degree corner on the root. So I'm literally just putting more weld down on that first pass. There's my second bead. A little bit shaky. Again, the camera's really right in the way. I know I keep saying that as an excuse, but well, it is. It's just in the way. Stand that back up, make sure it's in focus. Looks pretty decent. And we'll go ahead and we will burn another rod. Again, on this second rod, I am, just like with the horizontal position, I want to add about 1/8 of an inch of weld to the right leg, and I want the weld to blend into the hump up this previous pass. So I'm going to be holding both edges more or less uniformly. Again, a slight wiggle left and right. So there is my second pass in what would be a multi-pass vertical weld. We'll chip this slag off. Should wait for it to cool, but I'm going to start chiseling now. I'm being impatient. It is February break for school, and I'm still at work. So again, there's a multi-pass weld. That's the basic technique. As I've said a million times before, I'm sure the welds would be a little more uniform if I could see where I'm going without the camera in the way. But, you know, it's a perfectly serviceable weld, so it gets the job done. Now, what we're going to do on the upper half of this is we're going to look at weaving, okay? Weaving is a necessity. It happens from time to time. If you take a look at the video that I did on weld distortion, you know, keeping the plate hot will reduce distortion. It doesn't add to it. It's a common misconception. So weaving can actually reduce weld distortion. There are circumstances where you have heat input restrictions because of heat-treated steels, in which case you can't weave. And I'm not saying that you would want to just start putting monstrous beads over beads, but you know, there are times when weaving is perfectly acceptable. I'm going to continue this little section here up, and then when I get to the top, I'm going to start a weave over it.
Now, when I do this weave, really the limiting factor is the slag freezing to the left or to the right of me. If it is, I'm weaving too wide. I want to make sure that that entire puddle stays liquid. I do not want to remelt slag. I want to keep that slag in a molten state, or at least very, very soft. As I'm going across, I am holding the edges. I'm not spending any time in the middle. The middle will take care of itself. And again, this is about the largest weave I would ever do under any circumstances. I am not welding the plate faster by weaving. The rod
is burning off with 108 amps on it, and it will burn off only just so fast. I cannot make the rod burn quicker by weaving left and right, so I am not
welding the plate any quicker by putting down larger beads. It's just get that right out of your head. The weave would generally be necessary to prevent you from creating a sharp, deep valley in a groove weld that would trap slag. So if you're looking at a groove weld and you're wondering, should I squeeze in 2 tight passes or weave one? Weave one is probably the correct answer. And if you can't weave because of heat input, then you've screwed up. I'm just going to fill this up all the way to the top. I can stop.
All right, so this is it's a hot 1/4 inch plate. This is a 1/4 inch thick plate, and we've got a 3/8 weld on it. You wouldn't ever, under any real world circumstances, sorry about that. You wouldn't ever, under any real world circumstances, put that big of a weld down on that small of a plate. But again, for practice, it's something that you should know how to do. Now, that's it right there, folks. I would never go wider than that with stick electrode, at least not with 1/8 inch electrode. And there's people that are probably looking at this thinking, oh my God, I can't believe you just did that. Well, again, if there's no heat input restriction, there's no reason not to weave. There really isn't, okay? And when we get into groove welds, we will discuss this a little bit more, but you should know how to do both. You should know how to run stringer beads, like we have at the bottom, and you should know how to run weaves, like we have at the top. Happy welding.